Afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about garden planning. Now, whether that means a fresh garden or if it means extending your existing garden, we're going to cover kind of both of those concepts today. So let's get to it. This looks like it might be a good place for some non-water sensitive flowers. Look at that. Anyway, moving on. Things to consider are going to be lighting. And you can't really tell right now because of the gray overcast sky, but everything here is sort of universally well lit. I mean, you can tell that, but what you can't tell is where the shadows will fall. When considering lighting in the garden, the things you want to make sure of, if you live in the northern hemisphere anyway, or really even if you live in the southern hemisphere, although then the seasons are going to be reversed, you're going to want to go through and check where the sun and shadows are going to fall at the beginning of the growing season and at the end of the growing season. Unless, of course, you have a growing season that extends through the middle of your winter, in which case, then you're just going to have to kind of check it periodically. If you're like me, and you live in the northern hemisphere anyway, you're going to check and see where sunlight is going to show up from roughly April to roughly November. And again, if you live in a warmer or more southern climate, in the United States anyway, then your experience may vary a little bit. But in my case, I need to pay attention specifically from the middle of April to roughly the middle of October. Now, you can grow things before and after that, depending on what family it's in, but that's the majority of our growing season, and that's where first and last frost occur. So, something to keep in mind is if you are doing this and you're going through and checking where shadows are going to fall in the winter, you need to do it on a sunny day. Obviously, don't do it on an overcast day like today. Or maybe it's sunny where you are, but here it's not. Or you're going to have to just kind of know from previous experience where the shadows fall. Now, in my case, this side yard here gets a decent amount of shade in the winter, as everything does around here. But in the summer, this is in broad sunlight the whole friggin' time, basically. So, what that means is I can plant things here that don't need a whole lot of light in the winter and need a bunch of light in the summer. A lot of daylight hours are available here in this side yard. Now, this spot's only about 5 feet wide. So, my plan here is actually to go right about in this section, and that's where I'm going to put two planters that are going to be 4 by 4, 4 foot by 4 foot, I should say, and that's going to hold blueberry plants. We'll get to that at some point. So anyway, when you're considering lighting, let's go to the garden. Welcome to the garden proper. Now, discussing sunlight. So, first of all, you're going to want to know which direction your property is oriented. That's going to help immensely when picking out where you're going to put your plants. So, in my case, the direction I'm currently facing is east, which makes this direction south, obviously north, and then back towards the house would be west, which means the sun's going to travel in an overhead pattern from in front of me to behind me. And as you can see, I've got the garden beds oriented that way. Let's go over here and take a closer look. As you can see here, this is again east. Here's the direction the beds are oriented, and this means that everything in each individual bed is going to get nice exposure to the sun. Now, you're going to notice that across the back wall of the property, we have a bunch of trees, which blocks the early morning sun until, 11 a.m. or so from hitting this furthest reach of the garden. And over here in the furthest reach of the garden, we have what would be the tomato bed. So, you might wonder why I have something like tomatoes, which require a lot of sunlight, getting limited amounts of sunlight because the east-facing direction over here, especially that back side of the tomato bed, which is going to be in between the front, front, for lack of a better term, side of the bed and the trees in the east. The reason I did this is because these tomato plants are all indeterminate. None of them are bushing varieties, and because of that, they tend to become quite tall. They don't really suffer from a lack of sunlight in this, because they grow faster than most of the other things here, and hit a height that's higher than just about anything else. That puts them in good stead for getting more sunlight than a lot of the other plants, actually. So it's not really a concern. The big thing you want to do is make sure that your tall stuff, especially when it comes to lighting concerns anyway, is not going to overshadow the short stuff. So for instance, I have tomato bed here. You'll notice there's nothing in between the tomato bed and that east wall. If I were to put something there, it would be something that doesn't need a whole lot of sunlight, like currants or something like that, where it doesn't necessarily have to have a bunch of sun in order to thrive. Next to that, I had the brassica bed. These brassicas, specifically, nothing in here got that tall. Some of the sprouting broccoli got, I don't know, 4.5 feet tall, so significantly tall, but not tall enough to be shaded out by, or to cause any shading of the tomato plants. Here, you can't see it now, but this actually was a bean trellis that was approximately 7.5 feet, 8 feet tall, something like that. And it would provide afternoon shade, but not morning shade and not noon shade. So only in the late afternoon, it was providing shade to the brassica bed. And this actually seemed to work rather well. These plants were doing much better up until the frost in late December killed most of them. Still holding out hope for a couple of them. There's one kale anyway that looks like it's doing okay. Good on you, buddy. Anyway, moving on. So basically, when you're picking out places to put lighting, I like to run my beds in this direction. So the beds themselves run north to south, lengthwise. That allows the sun to pass, overhead, like not like that, like this, overhead, like that, And then that provides uniform sunlight exposure to everything in the bed without making any portion of the bed significantly shade any other portion of that same bed. If you ran them, for instance, going this direction, then the stuff on the east side of the bed would shade out the west side in the morning, and the west side of the bed would shade out the east side in the morning, or in the afternoon. Yeah, in the afternoon. So that would not be the best way to do it. The wind's picking up, so we're going to let this sit for a minute. So yeah, it doesn't look like much now because this is kind of the off season, obviously. But during the summer, everything here that requires full sun thrives. This worked very well last year in this orientation, and when I build out more beds, I'm going to continue building in this direction up until I get within 8 feet of these little apple trees. Once I get within 8 feet of the apple trees, I've hit their drip line and cannot continue going towards the house, because that is my line of demarcation, basically. Also, these trees, they're dwarf apple trees. They're going to cast a shadow. They're going to get about 8 feet tall. Now, they're apple trees, so they don't get really dense foliage, especially since these are going to be grown not for shade, but for fruit. So because of that, they're going to have the ability to provide some shade to the plants in the garden, but not a lot. So it's not going to be this huge issue. But anyway, if you're going to plant trees, keep that in mind. So, that covers lighting. The next thing we're going to cover. Bam. Water. Now, water and drainage are sort of related here, but we're going to cover water availability first, and then we're going to cover drainage issues. So water availability, that's going to be important because you're going to want your stuff to be within range of a hose, unless you happen to have like a rainwater collection system handy already, or like a pond that you can locally pull, or a stream that you can locally pull water from. Then you're going to have to use at least some hose water. And in order to do that, you need to have a hose present. Now, I have a hose here. You can see it goes over here, goes under the snow, kind of goes around. You can't really see where it goes. I'm going to tell you, it does not go to my shed. It goes all the way along the side of the yard to the back. You can't even see how far back it goes. But it goes all the way back there to where the hose spigot is. I have two 100-foot long hoses connected in order to do this. Well, I mean, they're not connected right now. You can kind of see the spot right there where they're not connected, because I had to let all the water out of the hose for the season. But, just keep that in mind. You're going to want to have a hose handy, or expect to spend some money on hoses and running them and dragging them all over the yard. It's Not ideal. One of my plans is to get a rainwater collection system installed on the shed and on the awning in the back of the garage there. So, that, however, is a project for a different day and a different time. So that's availability of water. Now, let's talk about drainage. You're going to notice my yard is pretty flat, except for right there, and that's where the stump of the old tree was. Well, I mean, that's where the tree itself was, too. Till they took it out, and then it was a stump, and then they ground out the stump, and now it's just a huge pile of sawdust underneath that snow. So that's going to be something that I have to amend and fix. But that's not drainage, so we'll move on. Anyway, point is, yard is very flat. Because of that, I do have some problems with water pooling, but not much. Yard just kind of does its thing, absorbs the water, and I don't really have too many issues as far as drainage goes. If you happen to have a low spot in your yard, though, you're going to know that this is not the case for you. Your yard is going to collect all of the water in that one spot, and everything in it will die. So, because everything in it will die, unless you happen to have a willow plant or something living there, you're going to need to, build around the area for drainage. So, there are a couple solutions to this, but my personal favorite, you can probably guess just from looking at my garden here, and that is raised garden beds. One of the biggest advantages to raised garden beds, or at least a big advantage to raised garden beds, is the fact that they sort of mitigate a lot of drainage issues unless you have some serious problems with drainage. A 10-inch incline, like these beds provide, roughly 10 inches of vertical movement. In order for this area to get flooded beyond these plants' ability to cope, the water that would need to be standing in the yard would have to be 5 inches deep or so. And I don't expect to have that problem. If I do, then this entire area is flooded, and there was nothing I could realistically do to prevent that from being a problem anyway, so I'm not going to worry about it. There's just no point in getting upset about that. So, make sure when you're planting things out and when you're picking the kind of style of garden beds you're going to do, whether it's raised bed gardening or it's in-ground gardening or it's container gardening, I've got a mixture of all three here, honestly. Just make sure that whatever you pick works for the area that you're planting in. If you do raised bed, it'll work pretty much anywhere, but does tend to have the highest upfront cost. Container gardening is nice for limited spaces, and if you need to move things around. These, for instance, are really nice. You can move plants around to get different kinds of sun. I'm not going to have to do that anymore because I don't have the tree that was blocking it, but last year I did move these around periodically because the oak tree that was in the yard was throwing a shadow over the entire yard every day that covered, I don't know, probably half of the backyard at any given point in time and lasted for 4 or 5 hours. So, yeah, not great. For that kind of thing, or if you're, planting on a balcony, you can't have a, in-ground bed or something like that. Container gardening is great. Just keep in mind with container gardening, you're going to have to water more frequently. And the soil can be a little finicky. You have to get soil that drains better, and that's just this whole thing. We'll talk about that specifically at a later date. But it's not too bad. You just kind of get the right stuff for it, and off to the races you'll go. In-ground gardening works fine. Probably the cheapest method to go with. Also very labor intensive, especially to get it started. As an example, you can't see it really because these trees are currently underneath a layer of mulch and snow. The trees aren't, but their roots are. You can see the mulch here. So for this tree, and actually for all three of these trees, I did what's called double digging in order to put these in the ground. I dug out an area about 4 foot square, I'd say, 4 foot square and a foot deep. Dug all that out, and then dug out the next foot down, and moved that over, and then put the dirt from the first foot into that, mixed in fertilizer and like mushroom compost and things like that, just a little bit to help kind of amend the soil. That is an immense amount of work, and I only did that for 3 trees. If you wanted to do that for something the size of this garden bed, that is going to take you days of very intensive work. So just Just know going in to using in-ground gardening, like, just in-ground beds, that requires a bit more maintenance, especially if you don't have it set up so that you can avoid walking on the beds, because then you're going to compact the ground and you're going to have to double dig more frequently to kind of loosen things up. I did it for the trees because the trees were in an area that was untested, and actually I'm glad I did that, because I found all sorts of garbage in my yard, and I mean like literal garbage, like old bicycle rims and broken glass, and it looked like somebody had a big char pile here at one point, and they just kind of buried over it, so I had to clear all that out, and it was a thing. It was a bit of an ordeal, but anyway, it's fine now. Trees are doing well so far. Time will tell on those. This is their first year in the ground, so we'll see how things go in the future. So, container gardening, raised bed gardening, or in-ground gardening, all of those are viable. I'm using in-ground gardening, obviously, for the trees. You could put trees, depending on the size you think they're going to get to, in containers, but the containers have to be very, very large. Think like half barrels, that sort of thing, and we have one of those to move, or to put our Christmas tree in, that when we set it up for the year. Those are very heavy, so just be aware. You fill that with dirt, it's going to be virtually impossible to move without, like, equipment. I don't know if a furniture dolly is going to cover it, so, just know going in, if you're going to do container gardening for anything bigger than like a blueberry bush, you're gonna possibly have a bad time. One of the other nice things about raised beds is that if you don't know what kind of soil you're getting into, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying about the trees and finding a bunch of garbage in the yard, if you don't know what kind of soil you're getting into, a raised bed garden is a good way to just kind of skip all that. You're putting your own dirt in, so you know exactly what's going in then. You just have to amend it and build the soil from there. So, we've covered light, we've covered water, we've covered drainage, we've covered the kinds of beds, and under what circumstances you'd use different kinds. The next thing to cover is how big of a garden should you go for? Well, my recommendation, if you are new to the gardening game, honestly, if you're new to the gardening game, something like this, which is a 6-foot by 4-foot bed, this is a nice way to start. Get yourself a couple tomato plants, maybe a zucchini plant or two, some radishes or some lettuce. You could plant this out and do all sorts of fun stuff with it. The big thing here is to make sure that you're planting things that you're interested in, like I did with my currants, or that you're excited about growing. Don't just go and get a bunch of seeds because, oh, hey, this variety sounds cool, and you haven't done really any research into it, and next thing you know, you've got 20 different varieties of tomatoes that you're trying to grow all simultaneously, and then half of them turn out to not do well in your area, or they're just not very good. I sort of ran into that problem last year with the white tomatoes I was trying to grow next to my blueberries tomatoes. Turns out I wasn't a huge fan of either one, so the blueberries are stunning to look at, and they made so many tomatoes, but the tomatoes themselves being a savory cherry tomato, a savory indeterminate cherry tomato, they made tons of cherry tomatoes that I just didn't really appreciate the taste of. So when they were fully ripe, they were great, but when they had a hint of unripeness to them, they were in my opinion, some of the worst tomatoes I've ever tried. So, not in a store-bought tomatoes are disappointing sort of sense, but in a these just taste weird sort of sense. So, anyway, my advice on that front, don't go overboard if it's your first year doing any kind of gardening thing. It really doesn't matter what you're doing. I suppose that applies to any hobby, honestly. Don't go overboard. Gotta exercise some self-caution when it comes to that. If you're going to expand your garden, the same sort of principle applies. This year, I am adding, for instance, a couple of small raised beds that are this size. I'm adding these up front by the garbage and recycling cans in that area, which was the area from the beginning of the video. I'm adding that so that I can put in some blueberry bushes, and my goal is to get the blueberry bushes well established, and then once those are established, I'm going to add cranberry bushes to them as well. Short cranberry bushes, so that get a mix of berries and whatnot from up there. I think that might be fun, and I do quite like blueberries and cranberries, so that works out well for me. I'm also going to be adding an asparagus bed, and an asparagus bed is kind of an interesting thing. Unlike most of these beds are all meant for annual plants, with the exception of this one. This is a currant bed, and by currant I mean that's the kind of plant that's in it, not it is currently a bed. It is currently a currant bed, if I may. Anyway, that's a dumb joke. It's, I can't bear making terrible jokes like that. That was also bad. Anyway, moving on with life, and hopefully no more bad jokes. This is a currant bed, and because it's a currant bed, these are bushes. These are bushes kind of like blackberries or raspberries. They're bushes in that sort of sense. These are going to keep growing, and this is where they're going to always live. So because they're a perennial, they get their own dedicated bed. That's also why it's a metal bed as opposed to a wooden bed. The wooden beds, you're going to have to rebuild them in several years' time, and I just don't want to hassle with that when I've got, perennials in there. These, however, these are all annual beds. Annual beds, you can change them up. If I want to, I can move that tomato trellis to where the beans were and put the beans where the tomatoes were, and mix it up there. If I was starting to run into pest pressure or things like that, do a little crop rotation. It's not a bad idea, certainly. That is, annuals. Perennials like currants, raspberries, blueberries, blackberries, my trees, like the 3 different varieties of apple trees I have over there, the blueberries that I'm going to plant. I don't remember if I said that already. Anyway, all of that, the asparagus that I'm going to be planting, that is all perennial. And the difference being, of course, annual is plants that are only going to be around for right now. Perennials are going to be plants that come back year after year. Or just exist and overwinter like the trees do. Because the asparagus bed is going to be used for asparagus, it is also a metal bed, like this one, but it is a different shape. So we'll get to that later. I've actually got the beds for the blueberries and the asparagus. I've already received them. Everything there is good to go. I'll probably do a little unboxing thing for them at some point here as we get a bit closer to the season. We've got to fill them, all that rot, so, That brings us to what kind of plants. So we've covered so far lighting, the sunlight exposure. We've covered the availability of water. We've covered proper drainage. We've covered the types of beds that you can use, and a bit of wind, directions things should face. We've covered the varieties you're going to go for, but what about the kinds of plants? Like, let's say you want to grow apple trees, but you live in southern Florida. I'm going to tell you right now, apple trees in southern Florida, not a great combination. It can work. You got to look for real specific apples. Apple trees need what's called chill hours, and some plants, a lot of plants, especially in my area, require chill hours, which is probably a good thing because as you can see from all the snow, we get a fair amount of them. So, chill hours are kind of quasi-related to your growing zone. And your growing zone is going to determine, and it only determines, what kind of plants will overwinter in your area. Like, that's the kind of plant that you can expect reasonably to overwinter in your area. It's going to be a plant that is set to grow in your growing zone. So, for instance, I'm in zone 6B. This means things like cherry trees, apple trees, pear trees, plum trees, asparagus, raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, things like that. Most varieties of most of those plants will grow fairly well here. You want to know what doesn't grow very well here? Peaches. If I want to pick a peach plant, I have to be specific about which kind of peach plant to pick. I cannot grow easily things like pineapple or citrus like lemons. My wife loves lemons. I can't realistically grow lemons here easily. Now, can I do it? Yes, I'd have to do what's called pushing my zone. That's a whole other thing. We'll get into that later. I'm saying for the purposes of your basic garden setup and planning, you're not pushing zones. You're not, that's a whole different thing. So try to pick plants, if you intend for them to overwinter and come back year after year anyway, try to pick plants that will actually do okay in your growing zone, because otherwise you're going to run into a problem with them surviving. Growing zones specifically correlate to the amount of cold that is expected to be reached over the course of the season. So, for instance, growing zones, the lower the number in the growing zone, the colder you can expect the winters to be. And the colder the winters are, the worse it is for most plants. Not all plants. Asparagus and raspberries specifically do pretty well in cold areas, but there's other plants that do too. You just have to kind of be mindful if it's something that you are planting that is not an annual. So for instance, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, broccoli, kale, garlic, onions. Well, garlic and onions might be a little bit of an exception to that, but melons, zucchini, beans, all of this stuff, it's all annuals. Doesn't matter what your growing zone is, plant it. The only thing you have to keep in mind for those is the amount of, like the length of your growing season might be an issue. If you pick like a pepper plant, for instance, that takes 120 days to reach maturity, if you do not start that indoors and you only have 110 days in your growing season, then you might have a problem. You might not get anything out of that plant before the chill comes in and kills it. But generally speaking, that's not going to be a huge issue, unless you live pretty far north or pretty far south if you're in the southern hemisphere. So just keep that in mind. Now, the reason that onions and garlic might be considered an exception to that is if you are attempting to grow them from seed to the point where they are expected to give seed. Onions and other things like pretty much everything I can think of offhand in the allium family. And I'm showing this bed. You don't see anything here, but this is actually my garlic bed. I just don't see any garlic growing in it. And that makes me sad, except actually, I do! Wait a minute. Where is it? I can't even see it on the camera. There it is. It doesn't look good, but we did actually get shoots coming up. Okay, good. Small bit of excitement aside, we'll see how that works. There's some over there too. I am so happy to see that. Anyway, garlic, shallots, and onions, they're biennials. So they're going to come back after the first year. So they're going to grow the first year, and they're going to build up bulbs to a decent size in the first year. And then the second year, those bulbs are going to expend their energy to produce flower heads and seed heads. And then from there, you can gather more seeds. That's only going to be important if you plan to gather seed from them. If you don't plan to gather seed from them, then it's not going to matter if they're able to come back. That said, I had some bunching onions that were pulled when we moved from the old house in the heat of January, that's ridiculous. The heat of August, where it was 100 degrees outside for several days on end. We moved like right in the middle of this heat wave. It was not great. Not great. I always seem to move either when it's freezing or when it's... No, it's never when it's freezing. It's always when it's super hot outside. I don't know why I do that. Bad judgment on my part would be my guess. Anyway, moving on. I pulled these bunching onions from the ground and set them on a shelf in my garage. The garage is not climate controlled. It's not even really vented. I mean, it's got roof, you can kind of see it there. It's got little roof vents. But I mean, other than the little roof vents, there's no real ventilation except for when you open the doors. I mean, this garage had to be 90 degrees for months. I was able to plant that bunching onion, a bunch of those bunching onion plants in this little brown planter over here, where they continued to grow last year. So, onions are resilient plants. I got to give them credit for that. Didn't go to seed. I mean, obviously that's not what you want to do. You don't want to pull them and sit them on a shelf for months and then replant them out. But know that you can, and they actually did bulk up more. And they were still good eating. So, kind of interesting how that worked. So, yeah, allium family, you kind of have to worry about your zone. And there's long day onions and short day onions, and there's a whole thing. And soft neck garlic and hard neck garlic, and that's kind of a whole thing too. Then those each tend to grow in different zones better. You know, they're specific to certain zones. In my case, everything I'm growing is made for this zone. But I don't really expect it to go to seed, so it's not a huge issue. I don't really... Actually, you know, that brings an interesting point. The garlic that I planted in the ground, the garlic I know is fine because it came from this area as well. It's native to this area, or at least it's been naturalized to this area. We call it grandpa garlic because it comes from my wife's grandpa's house. We don't actually know what variety it is, so now it's just grandpa garlic. That's its name now. But also in there is elephant garlic and shallots, and I don't know if the elephant garlic or shallots are actually okay to overwinter in this area. So maybe they're going to die. I don't actually know. I see garlic shoots on the far side of the bed, and I see garlic shoots on this side of the bed. So I don't see anything down the middle yet, but now I have hope. And that's a dangerous thing. Now, maybe the shallots won't make it, but I think the elephant garlic and the regular garlic did. Interesting. It's good to see. I'm not perfect. I make mistakes too. We've covered growing zones. We've covered what to grow. We've covered how much to grow. Spacing of plants. That's more of a planting out thing, not a planting thing. So, yeah. I mean, if you're just going to go and you're going to pick some varieties, then I'd say, especially if you're new to gardening, grab a couple bush beans. I'd probably go with maybe 4 of the same plant. You could do this in a bed this size, no problem. Look into square foot gardening. The method I use is sort of similar to square foot gardening, but not quite. It's a little more cramped than that. High intensity spacing and all that, but square foot gardening is basically, it's a thing where you go through and it just says you can plant like two types of this plant within 1 square foot. So you go through and you mark your bed out with all these different strings, and it gives you like, here's a square foot of space, and a square foot of space, for instance, can hold like 1 head of lettuce or something like that. So I don't specifically do it, so I can't give you a whole lot of information on it, but it's a very easy method that is palatable to most people right from the get-go. So maybe give that a look. And, you know, if you're into garden planting and you're looking to do some garden planting, it's not a bad idea to look up some of the literature as well. Luke Marion, the guy who does M.I. Gardener, has a book that I found quite helpful. Maybe give that a read. A lot of the gardeners actually on YouTube have books and whatnot. So I have only read his so far from that specific group of people. But, yeah. I thought it was quite helpful. He talks about core gardening and composting and high intensity spacing and all sorts of stuff there. So there's a lot of good content, and I recommend it. Post-recording John here. I forgot to mention one other thing. As you can see, looking from behind me, you can see the backyard. And if I spin around, you can see the front yard. You're going to notice there's a house in the way. When you have raised garden beds like that, right? When you are looking at that kind of situation, raised garden beds contain an enormous amount of dirt. I say enormous, it's not really enormous. Like in the scheme of things, it's probably a pretty small amount of dirt, but when you're shoveling it and you're carrying it, say you're carrying 40-pound bags of dirt, I want you to realize that a single 4-foot by 4-foot garden bed requires something like 20 bags of dirt. So just one other thing I'd recommend is if you're doing raised garden beds, make sure that you have a wagon or a wheelbarrow and a path to go from the front to the back.
Now in my case, I actually have a door in the back of my garage I can open up, and I can open up the front of the garage and then just walk stuff right through in my gorilla cart. Um, if you have this sort of setup and you don't like how wheelbarrows fall over, a gorilla cart is a great way to go, by the way. Just a recommendation there. We have definitely gotten our money's worth out of ours, and I think it'll be good for at least another year. So, yeah, just keep that in mind. If you're going to build like this many raised garden beds, the wood wasn't that bad to get back there. My wife and I just carried one board at a time because they were 14-foot long boards. And we just carried them from the driveway through the garage and into the backyard. That wasn't too bad. But the dirt, it ended up taking something to the tune of like 10 cubic yards of dirt. I don't even remember how much dirt it was. I think that's not quite right. I don't think that was enough. It was literally like 27,000 pounds of compost and topsoil that we had to have delivered, and then we shoveled it one wagon full at a time, shoveled it into the wagon, and then moved it one wagon full at a time from the front to the back, and then dumped it. So just know it's a several day project just to fill the beds. If you're doing this with 40-pound bags of dirt, you are going to break your back with that labor. So if you're going to do it with bags of dirt, maybe just limit yourself to one bed per year, or find some help in moving those bags, because it's going to be a bad time. or it's going to depend on how much you like physical labor. I mean, physical labor is fine, but it's a bit much for, that size of a garden to roll that out all in 1 year and then be like, okay, here, we're going to move, 200 of these bags, or I don't even know how much it would have been. It's just a lot, so just be aware that it's a lot. Okay, cool, thanks.
If you have any questions about any of this, let me know. Hopefully this was helpful. Until we talk again.